So we're on to chapter 2 of Kill All Normies, and this chapter is about the online politics of transgression. And you always know you're in trouble when someone quotes bell hooks. I'm not quite sure how you speak in lowercase. I wouldn't want to offend. There's a lot of padding, waffle, and frankly pseudo-intellectual analysis of a literary type throughout this chapter, which just doesn't really seem apt to me. The internet is not a static thing. It's not like a painting or a book. It's not amenable to examination using the tools that have been developed to examine paintings or books. And frankly, that kind of critical analysis, I've never seen the worth. The only person who really knows what they meant in creating a piece of art or a piece of writing is the person who created it. Anyone else's opinion is frankly secondary. And I don't think there's much use, much value. I don't think people get many hits on the actual meaning of stuff when they do this analysis. It's intellectual self-masturbation to do so. So personally, I don't see the value, but I particularly don't see the value in this instance when we're talking about the internet. It's a living medium. She does make a valid observation in broader strokes, though, that transgression has become to be seen as valuable in and of itself in Western art. But that can be transgression of all sorts of things, even the concept of art itself. But this is perhaps why we've seen modern art become things like, people's poop in a jar, or animals sawn in half, or whatever. It's people seeking a way to transgress, and that becomes harder and harder as time goes on, as it gets shifted, and seems to have reached its kind of peak, really, in that regard. It'd be interesting to see what comes next, whether it's a collapse back to traditional craftsmanship and so on, or representative art, or what. But all this transgression was traditionally, sounds contradictory but isn't, but it was traditionally a transgression against conservative values. That is, that all of these artistic movements and pushes and political movements that went along with them, literary movements as well, a lot of it has been about pushing boundaries, so overcoming sexual prudishness, mocking religion, representing violence, representing homosexuality, representing race mixing, and so on. Things that offended and triggered, for want of a better word, traditional conservative and religious values. So all of that transgression traditionally really used to come from the left, which was seeking to overcome existing social hierarchies and so on. So that's where that came from in the past. She also correctly observes, I think, that transgression now often comes from, or appears to come from, the right. But I think she fails to note that it also comes from what I might personally call the genuine left, and groups like cultural libertarians, those who hold to these values as a value in and of itself, not just as a protest against conservatism. What's changed is that the people being triggered now are on what's called the left, but it isn't really, at least not philosophically, not ideologically. The right wing, the traditional groups and so on, have been replaced by this pseudo left, and this pseudo left is now what's upset by sexual depiction. They're the ones that won't let you assault religious sensibilities, so long as it's Islam anyway. They're the ones wincing and wringing their hands at depictions of violence and demanding that you not racially appropriate, even in some cases finding issues between mixed relationships, wanting to resegregate schools and so on. It's weird. It might not be large C conservative, but it's definitely small c conservative. And so it's little wonder that these are the people being rebelled against now by these other groups. It was understood more in the past, as is mentioned in the book, that you could parody a thing, represent a thing, without becoming that thing. Even if Susie Sue got beaten up for wearing a swastika, most sensible people understood that she wasn't condoning Nazism. Somehow that ability to understand irony, to understand sarcasm, to understand that kind of paradoxical juxtaposition, that's been lost. You know, if you make a joke about Nazism now, as has happened with Count Dankula and the Sieg Heiling Pug, yeah, even if you're doing it in jest, even if you're using it to mock these right-wing values or whatever, as well, saying that, you know, this is the worst thing ever, which he literally did in the video, you're going to be taken as though you're promoting hate speech and so on. If you write a book where the villain rapes somebody, you'll be held accountable as if you raped somebody. You know, it's absurd. But this is coming from, for want of a better term, establishment liberals. They still don't understand that they are the establishment, and they wield the power, and that they are enforcing their own moral system in a way that is just as oppressive, just as interfering in its own way as that of the old Christian right. They've just convinced themselves that it's okay somehow. To repeat again, that, you know, that absolutely does not mean that any opposition to them is automatically right wing. Yeah, any more than the murderous spat between Stalin and Trotsky meant that Trotsky was right wing. You know, the genuine left, again for want of a better term, opposes the pseudo left precisely because of its left wing values. And, you know, libertarians will always protest authoritarians. This is the way it is. It doesn't make them right wing. It doesn't make them Nazis. There's a sort of side section in the chapter which is full of pretentious excuses on the part of trolls. There's an interview with Weave, who's trying to pass off what he does as some kind of art or so on. This just reeks of rationalisation to me. If there are trolls that can elevate it to an art form, perhaps Godfrey Elfwick is the one you should be talking to. You know, his ability to play off people's stupidity and their kind of ideological underpinnings, to expose them is masterful, though less so as he's become more and more well known. But what Weave says, what his partner in the interview piece says, just sounds like rationalisation and excuse making. You know, there is a lot of cruelty that goes on in trolling, the stuff that transcends trolling to the point of becoming genuine abuse, I think. Things like going onto people's memorial pages and saying horrible shit about the dead, or spamming them with horrible images. I mean, there is a transgressive element there, but I think to most people's sensibilities, even to most trolls, that is a step too far. That's something that's unacceptable even in the troll code or whatever it is. Considering that kind of extreme to be representative of the whole is, again, insane. And this is another thing that keeps happening throughout this book, this taking the extremes and applying them to the whole. And the book rhymes. The same unproven assumptions and assertions have appeared in every chapter thus far. Keeps taking trolls seriously, fails to decode irony, tries to force everything into that outmoded left-right schema. I appreciate it's difficult to discern what people online really think and feel, and it's very easy for them to front as something false. But even just considering Transgression, it's an inherently left libertarian position to take to be transgressive. Left-wing philosophy tends to be focused around removing hierarchies and stopping controlling forces coming into power. You know, that's an inherent concept in socialism, for example. Transgression challenges and removes moral authorities. In the past, that might have been tradition or the church, or your cultural modes of enforcing morality. Today, these transgressive culture warriors are challenging the unfounded assumptions and moral impositions of feminism, of racism campaigners, of social justice warriors. You know, these are the people they're challenging. They're challenging the new priesthood and the new blasphemies. That remains an activity, whatever the individual's affiliation, that remains an activity that is rooted in the traditions of the left, the overthrowing of the existing, the removing of systems of power, the prevention of new hierarchies taking place. The right's just kind of joining in on this, where they align. You know, the right might want the ability to transgress against this moral imposition without being interfered with. It's not necessarily a good thing, but then you really get into discussions about the intersection of rights, you know, freedom from and freedom to, and so on. But transgression itself, it's definitely rooted in the traditions of left libertarian and libertine politics, that of free thinkers and rebels. That's the tradition that it's in. A comparison I would make here to try and show how this works, I think, would be to look to the Atheism Plus debacle in the atheist and skeptic community, which is kind of passing into history now, really, but still relevant and a useful model. Much of that community was transgressive in the sense that it was challenging conservative and religious viewpoints on the grounds of them being irrational and stupid. You know, that was the basis to attack them, not for any other reason. Their values in that part of the community were centered around that skepticism. You know, the transgression was incidental to their goal of debunking bullshit. But another smaller part of that community was transgressing against conservative and religious values, less from a grounding in skepticism and empiricism and science and rationality and logic and reason and all the rest, but more because they were opposed to the political positions. So as things shifted within that community, they didn't have that core value of skepticism. Their core value was their politics. And so they allowed their skepticism to bend when it came to their politics. Whereas those who kept their skepticism as their central point, as their core, their focus, ended up applying that skepticism to that political wing's beliefs and assertions, and they didn't fare so well. They were setting themselves up as this new moral arbiter, trying to set themselves up almost to replace religion and to impose their own moral system on their fellow skeptics, and their fellow skeptics looked at what they were saying, weighed it, measured it, found it wanting, and dismissed it, and that led to this huge acrimonious split. And I think much the same thing, it explains the confusion of the author here. The value for these transgressors is in transgressing. It's not necessarily for any political end, though it does fit philosophically better with the left sort of libertarian side. That's why they do it. It's not political affiliation. So yet again, to try and peg them to the right, or indeed to the left, I'm not saying I'm pegging them to the left, I'm just saying that's where the tradition lies, is just jumping the gun massively.